It's Father's Day this Sunday. Please let us know you're safe and well. If anyone has information that can help Lynda, please contact us. That was Patricia Spence, recorded on the 14th of June 2011 in Glasgow. Patricia is pleading for anyone with information about her missing daughter, Lynda Spence, to contact the police. What she doesn't know is that her daughter had just gone through one of the worst ordeals that any human being could fear to suffer. Lynda had disappeared 2 months earlier, on the 14th of April 2011, and was reported missing on the 13th of May. In an interview, her mother said that Lynda had never caused any trouble. She was kind, successful, and hard-working, yet despite being very busy, Lynda always had made time for weekend dinners and shopping trips with her mum. They spoke on the phone every day, so when Lynda suddenly stopped answering, her mother knew that something was terribly wrong. But as police began to investigate, they uncovered a very different picture of Lynda, one that didn't quite match the image her mother had painted. By the age of 24, after years of working in the bank, Lynda had decided that she'd got enough experience to try and open her own business, offering financial advice. Unfortunately, this didn't work out, and she was soon forced to declare bankruptcy. A year later, Lynda's debts were written off. Around the same time, she inherited a large sum of money and she decided to try again. Her new business, Fraser Properties, was based in Glasgow and focused on mortgages and lettings, and it seemed that this time she'd struck gold. The business was so successful that she was soon able to purchase 2 flats in one of the city's most expensive neighborhoods. Lynda loved the luxurious lifestyle, and now she could finally afford expensive cars, designer clothes, and premium alcohol. As her business flourished, she treated herself and her friends to bottles of champagne on nights out and picked up the bill at top restaurants. She also frequented exclusive nightclubs and high-end casinos. But there was a dark secret underlying her success. The truth was, building a successful business the traditional way would require specialist knowledge and years of hard work. But Lynda had found an easier way. She was a confident, charming, and likable woman, and she knew exactly how to use those traits to gain people's trust. Unfortunately, as many would later learn, that trust was badly misplaced. Lynda was a con artist. At one point, she persuaded around 30 families from Glasgow's Chinese community to invest their life savings in a property development in the Maryhill area. She collected over £170,000 from them as deposits. But it turned out that Lynda had no connection to these properties at all. She simply pocketed the money and spent it on herself. When the anxious clients began to ask questions, Lynda was always able to lie her way out of it. Her charm bought her time, and so it took a while before anyone reported her to the police. And then she met Colin Coates. 41-year-old Colin was a former IT specialist who had once been wildly successful. In his younger years, he'd made a fortune in London's financial sector. By his 30s, he was a millionaire with a wife, 3 children, and a perfect life. But for some people, such massive success can be a curse in disguise. At some point, Colin had begun spiraling down. The addictions he developed to drugs and alcohol only propelled his downfall, and soon he began to encounter legal troubles. He'd assaulted his sister-in-law, and then he assaulted an elderly man who tried to intervene. The court sentenced him to 2 months probation. But this didn't work as any kind of wake-up call. Actually, it was quite the contrary. Colin seemed to embrace the monster that he was becoming. He grew selfish, arrogant, and extremely violent. A former friend of his was quoted as saying, "He went from an unassuming IT geek to a psycho gangster in 8 years." A video from this period shows Colin Coates in drag boasting about dealing drugs. During the video, he delivers this disturbing line: "Young men for extortion, abduction, tying up, volunteering funerals for mixes. In 2010, Colin and Lynda entered into a business deal. Coates invested £85,000, everything that he had left from his once lavish life. It's unclear whether Lynda truly understood at this point who it was that she was trying to scam. According to Lynda, this investment would yield a return of £131,000. At first this sounded promising, but Coates wasn't naive. He quickly sensed that something wasn't right, and he confronted Lynda. What he didn't know was that she'd already spent all of his money, but she did manage to calm him down somehow. She claimed to be involved in a lucrative property development project near Stansted Airport. She told Colin that if he just waited a little longer, his profits would exceed £1 million. She layered in convincing details to make the lie feel real, explaining that the payout would come in Danish government bonds to avoid UK taxes. So he agreed to wait, but he couldn't wait forever. As time passed and Coates began asking more questions, Lynda decided she had to act. She convinced a Glasgow printer to produce a set of fake Danish government bonds that she could show him. They had no real value, but they looked authentic. When she gave them to Coates, he was initially very happy, and it bought her a little more time. Whether at this point she had a master plan, or she was simply panicking, is unclear. But eventually Colin Coates realized that these bonds were worthless. For a man like Colin Coates, being fooled twice and losing the last of his fortune to someone like Lynda was intolerable. His ego simply couldn't handle the humiliation. Meanwhile, Lynda was still on the lookout for new investors. She convinced a property developer named John Glenn to give her £180,000 as part of another fake deal. Like Colin Coates, John Glenn quickly realized that he'd been scammed, and he demanded his money back. He sent her a series of threatening text messages. In one of these messages, he said he would cut off her fingers and chop off her head. Lynda began to realize she'd gotten herself mixed up with some very dangerous people, and she might not be able to talk her way out of it this time. She needed a solid plan, but unfortunately, at this point her past began catching up with her. Back when she was 17 and working at a bank call center, she'd become involved with a man named Sokol Zephi. The two had met whilst working at the same bank. Sokol Zephi was a former Albanian asylum seeker who'd arrived in the UK with nothing, and within a few years had somehow amassed a property portfolio worth nearly £500,000. Despite presenting himself as a legitimate businessman, Zephi soon attracted the attention of law enforcement. In 2011, the Crown Office launched a major proceeds of crime action against him, freezing his assets, including 2 flats, a house, and 3 bank accounts. It was on the grounds that there was good arguable cause that they'd been obtained through drug dealing and fraud. Sokol Zephi was never criminally charged, and he denied all allegations. Allegedly, Lynda and Sokol Zephi were married. Although Lynda kept it a secret, she did have business cards printed with the name Lynda Zephi on them. Mr. Zephi later denied that they were ever married, although he did admit to having a sexual relationship with her. Whatever the truth, it seems that Lynda Spence and Sokol Zephi had a lot of dealings together, and at some point it looks like Mr. Zephi had stolen a large amount of money from Lynda Spence. Most likely this was the money that she would have used to pay back Colin Coates. In late 2010, her former school friend Amanda Robertson, who had worked for Lynda for a time, walked away from the business. She was uncomfortable with the constant customer complaints and the need to lie to people who had lost their life savings. Due to her role, Amanda had access to some of Lynda's emails. According to her, Lynda was involved in suspicious dealings with contacts in both Albania and the Arab world. Amanda would later testify in court that she'd also seen a series of angry emails relating to the money that Mr. Zephi had allegedly taken. One message sent from Lynda to Sokol Zephi read, I'm in the shit because of the money you stole out of the flat. It was not my money. Another one read, you need to give me the money back because I can't come back to Glasgow until you do. You have no idea whose money it is. That Christmas 2010, Lynda stayed at an expensive hotel in Glasgow, celebrating with her usual bottle of crystal champagne. But by New Year's, Fraser Properties had finally collapsed. After her business collapsed and her wealth vanished, Lynda was forced to rely on government benefits. She stayed afloat by selling some of her jewelry, but it couldn't cover all of her outgoings. She had been paying her parents rent, and so with the collapse of her business, they became temporarily homeless. After this, Lynda's behavior began to change. The first to notice was her mother. Although Lynda did still call her every day, she grew more distant over time, less eager to meet in person, and more evasive in conversation. This strange behavior worsened over time, until on Wednesday, the 13th of April 2011, Patricia Spence's birthday, Lynda showed up. But something was off. Patricia immediately noticed how tense her daughter seemed. Lynda didn't stay for long. She told her mother she needed to pop out for something, but promised that she'd be back within half an hour. She never returned. It's still unclear why Lynda left so abruptly that night, but what seems likely is that the next day, Tuesday the 14th of April, she drove to a house in Glasgow, a house that belonged to Colin Coates. Colin Coates was there waiting for her, but he wasn't alone. With him was a 40-year-old drug dealer who also worked as a drug debt enforcer. Just like Coates, Wade had a score to settle. In the past, Lynda had scammed him out of his own money too. The fact that she drove herself there willingly suggests that she had a plan. Perhaps she hoped to talk her way out of it in the same way she had many times before. Unfortunately for her, Coates and Wade weren't in the mood for any kind of negotiation. Lynda was restrained and forced into a car. They then drove her to a second property which belonged to a man named David Parker, a known drug addict. David Parker and his junkie housemate Paul Smith had agreed to rent out the flat for a few days, but it's not known whether they realized what was actually going to happen there. Lynda was taken to the attic and tied to this chair. Throughout the whole ordeal, she would remain in this chair. She was forced to wear glasses covered in black tape so that she was completely blind. She wasn't even allowed to get up to use the toilet. She spent all of her remaining days festering in her own waste. As part of the arrangement, Parker and Smith were to stay the property and keep an eye on Lynda. Coates and Wade left and returned sometime later with a bag which was described in court as a torture kit. Inside it were garden shears, a steam iron, surgical tape and a bucket. David Parker would later tell the police she was in a frightened state. When they put the hacksaw blades through my door, I realized it was high-duty serious. He also told police that whilst Coates and Wade were in the attic with Lynda, he could hear muffled cries and screams coming from upstairs. When the two men left again, Parker and Smith went up to the attic. Lynda was bloodied and bruised, her face was swollen, and there were burn marks on her skin where cigarettes had been put out on her. Colin Coates and Philip Wade would return every day, spending hours in the attic torturing Lynda. After each visit, Parker and Smith would go upstairs, allegedly to bring Lynda some tea or soup. They watched how her condition deteriorated after each visit. One day, she'd been left with horrific burns all over her body as her tormentors had pressed a hot steam iron against her. Another time, they'd crushed her toes with the garden shears and sliced off the tip of a finger. Another time, they shattered her kneecaps with a golf club. David Parker claimed that he was too afraid to intervene, fearing that the same thing would happen to him if he tried to go to the police. Parker believed that the only thing he could do was to try and convince Lynda to tell Coates and Wade whatever they wanted to hear to get the ordeal over with sooner. But she couldn't. The money was gone. There was no way she could tell them anything that would make them stop. If you're wondering why Lynda's disappearance wasn't immediately reported to the police, well, whilst Lynda was tied up in the attic, Colin Coates paid a visit to Lynda's parents. He claimed he didn't know where Lynda was, but when they said they would go to the police, he intimidated them, saying that he had some heavy contacts who would get them if they said anything to the police. He said that Lynda owed him 10 grand. He forced Lynda's parents to hand over their caravan, claiming that he could sell it for the 10 grand that he was owed. He then left, and Lynda's parents were too scared to do anything about it. On the 20th of April, 2011, 6 days after her disappearance, Lynda's parents were on their way to the shops when the phone rang. To their shock, the caller was Lynda. Patricia answered first, but the mix of stress and the overwhelming relief left her speechless, so she handed the phone to her husband. He later described Lynda's voice as being calm and composed. When he asked her where she was evasive and avoided specifics. Before hanging up, she reassured him, "I'll speak to you again soon," but she never did. To this day, it's unclear why Lynda was allowed to make that call, or how she managed to sound so composed. Most likely, her captors had forced her to make the call to try and stop her parents from getting too worried and going to the police. By that point, Lynda had endured nearly a week of daily torture, beatings, burns, and the loss of at least one finger, so she probably would have done anything that she was told. One theory is that she might have been trying to send a coded message, something that her mother might understand, but since her mum couldn't speak, Lynda ended up talking to her dad, who may have misread her vague responses as being simply evasive. Whatever the truth, this was the last time her family ever heard her voice. Later that same day, Coates returned to the house. He was alone this time. David Parker noticed that he seemed to be extremely angry. Coates went straight to the attic. Moments later, the people downstairs could hear Lynda's panicked screams. When Coates came back downstairs, he had Lynda's severed thumb in his pocket. During the torture, Lynda had revealed that she'd given part of Coates' money to John Glenn, the same man who she'd scammed and who had sent her violent threats. Coates decided to pay Glenn a visit. He brought the severed thumb with him in a plastic bag. When Coates met with Glenn, he used the thumb to intimidate him, and it worked. Colin Coates managed to extort some of his lost money from John Glenn. Afterwards, he reportedly went to the bathroom and flushed Lynda's thumb down the toilet. Now, although Colin Coates had recouped some of his losses, he didn't let Lynda go. Instead, he and Wade continued their daily visits to escalating the torture with each passing day. On the 27th of April 2011, Parker and Smith were told to leave the property. By then, Lynda's condition was catastrophic. She had severe burns on most of her body. Several of her fingers and toes had been cut off with garden shears or crushed. Both kneecaps were shattered, and for nearly 2 weeks she'd been bound in a sitting position to an uncomfortable metal chair covered in her own excrement. The following day, the 28th of April, Coates allegedly took Lynda into the bathroom. He would later boast to a cellmate that he'd covered her nose with his hand whilst her mouth remained sealed shut with black tape. She died slowly from asphyxiation. Once she was dead, Coates removed the head from her body. The next day, he and Wade attempted to borrow a boat from a friend, saying that they needed to get rid of something. Sensing that something was wrong, the friend refused. What happened to Lynda's body remains unknown. Coates would also tell his cellmates that he'd burned her body in a furnace, but this has never been conclusively proven. But they got rid of her body somehow, and once it was gone, Coates, Wade, Parker and Smith began a massive clean-up operation in the flat where she'd been held. This took a month. They removed every piece of furniture, every carpet. They scrubbed the house from top to bottom with bleach. Later, police footage of the house shows missing floorboards in the attic where Lynda had sat and bleeding and soiling for 2 weeks. Anything that might hold a trace of what had happened there was stripped from the property and burned in the garden. On the 13th of May 2011, Lynda was officially reported missing. On the 14th of June, Patricia made the public appeal on television, pleading for help in finding her daughter. The police had already begun identifying key suspects, but whenever Colin Coates's name came up, people refused to talk. It seemed that most people were terrified of him. The breakthrough came on the 16th of August, when John Glenn finally agreed to speak to the police. Until then, he'd refused to cooperate, but the day before, Colin Coates had come to his house. This time, he forced him to strip naked and extorted more money from him. When Coates left, the terrified John Glenn contacted the authorities. From there, the case began to unravel. The police tracked down David Parker and Paul Smith, who, in exchange for lighter sentences, agreed to tell them everything. On the 28th of October, officers entered the property where Lynda had been held. Forensic teams spent more than a week combing through the property inch by inch, but there was very little left for them to find. Finally, they discovered a tiny fragment of blood in the bathroom. DNA tests confirmed that this blood was Lynda's. Coates's fingerprint was also found on the bathroom door handle, the only place in the entire flat where his prints remained. Prosecutors later used this as proof that a large-scale and deliberate cleanup operation had taken place. During the trial, it was revealed that Coates had systematically intimidated nearly every potential witness, including Smith, Parker, and even Wade. David Parker, who owned the house where Lynda was held, got 11 years and 3 months in prison. His housemate, Paul Smith, got 11 years. For the kidnapping and torture of Lynda Spence, Philip Wade got 30 years. For the torture, kidnapping and murder, Colin Coates got life imprisonment with a minimum of 33 years. It was one of the longest sentences ever handed down by a Scottish court. To this day, Lynda's body has never been found, despite pleas from her family, including a final request from Patricia as she was suffering from terminal cancer. She said, "Lynda was my only child. It would mean everything to me to be able to lay her to rest. Without her body, there can be no closure." But neither Colin Coates nor Philip Wade ever revealed what they'd done with her remains. In their statement, Lynda's parents thanked the police and prosecutors who had worked to bring her daughter's murderers to justice. They said, "Lynda was a warm, kind, and thoughtful daughter, and was someone who always had time for others. We miss her so much." Thank you for watching the video. Another harrowing one this week. If you have found this video interesting, though, check out my channel. I've got plenty more disturbing stories on there. As always, thank you very much to the patrons. It really helps me out. Thank you for your support. And apologies if it sounds like my voice is going in this video. It's because my voice is going. Until next time, goodbye.